there we go. So I got to tell a quick story. That's why I always run out of time. But so when Chris mentioned the idea of roasting me, I said, "You're out of your effing mind." And then he's like, "No, but I'm serious." I'm like, "Okay." So I asked a person in the industry who I kind of know, and I said, "If you were chosen to roast me, what would you say?" And they said something terrible. I mean, like hit me to the quick, right? So I'm like, I go back to Chris and Chris, I don't want to do this. You know, like the first person I asked literally said something terrible about me. And then, but I love it because then I saw Nathan Harvey. And I've known Nathan forever. And Nathan's the nicest guy on the planet. So I go up there, I'm crying. You know, I call my wife, there's my wife here. And I'm like, I don't know, you know. And I call Nathan, Nathan, do you like me? And he goes, John, I love you. I'm like, okay, will you do the roast? So anyway, I felt a little better about it. So I asked ChatGPT, so I got to make fun of myself, right? So I asked ChatGPT, for those who know me, I'm a Deming freak. My last book was about Deming. So here's what O3 said about, if I asked him, he said, I'm going to roast a guy named John Willis, a.k.a. Botscaloop. Give me a joke. And it did that. But this is something I spent all night trying to find. So back in 2016, I worked for Docker. I sold the company to Docker, and I don't know what I was thinking when I made this pose when I was presenting at DockerCon, but a couple of people really picked up on it and made fun of me. So lessons learned, don't make stupid poses when you're speaking. There's me in that was a real picture. There's me saving the world. Scuba diving somewhere, I don't know, maybe in Hawaii. And then, all right, so I've done a lot of things. I'm not going to bore you with all that stuff. As you know, I sold the company to Docker. I've done quite a few cool things. I've got a fair amount of books now. Probably the most famous one is the DevOps Handbook, which I co-authored with some incredibly smart people. The book that I spent 10 years writing was a book about Dr. Deming. That's why people joke about me as being obsessed with Dr. Deming, which I am. But when I was asked, you know, all seriously now, right, so we're finished the joke, like, I'll talk about this new book I just finished, and as Chris said, we're going to do a book signing on it. And I was thinking, like, how do I use this book to sell it? But no, and when I'm presenting, I really wanted to think about, like, what is the arguments that we're not making about AI? And so some of this is a little heady, but, like, there's sort of, like, a historical construct to, like, if we don't know where we came from, then how do we know what we're doing? And then there's this sort of epistemological, the philosophical question of what is this thinking thing? And that's where it'll get a little meta. And I don't really cover the ethical argument, but, I mean, it's an important argument. I do cover it a little bit. But the historic perspective, so I wrote a book, giving out a preview copy, signed copy today. I'm hoping that it will drop on June 5th, but if you sign up for my newsletter, I'm going to have a special edition run of it, probably at the author cost. So today's books are free, but it's only half the book. So at any point, you go, it's just aicio.ai, and then anybody who subscribes to that will get the offer for the sort of the final but special print version. So what I did about 2 years ago, I had this idea of, like, there's a great story in the history of AI. And so I've literally, over about a 2-year period, have read, I think it's now 23 books of all these stories about AI. And I've made this list, and some of these books are amazing of what I've done to find out. And so one of the things I was thinking about when I was trying to writing a book about the history of AI is really difficult. It's not linear. There's, like, different paths. You've probably heard about expert systems, neural networks, all these things, right? And so every time I started going through any one thread, I realized it was going to make the reader's head spin. Because you like get all the way to 1998 and have to go back to 1950. And then you get all the way to 2005, and then you have to go back. And one of the things, I don't know if he's here. Derek, you here? Derek has been my consultant and helper, and he came up with this idea, why don't we do it based on the census? Then we have the freedom to follow a line of, like, how AI can count, think, learn, and so we would follow those threads, and at least it doesn't make your head spin. So that's sort of the way the book is constructed. And then the other question of all this, like why now, like why, I think there's a couple of things I think were interesting. I was at IBM at the beginning of the year, and I gave a presentation to the executives there, and I wanted to point out like the insanity of what's going on with AI. And I think you all know this, right? But so the first benchmarks were like in 1998. 1998 is a really interesting year. But basically, in 1943, the first paper about a neural network, like math, calculus of the brain, is in 1943. Right? So we've got what? From 1943 to 1998, we could say that's maybe the start of time, not really, but like that's when the first benchmark is. And in 1998 is interesting because it is it's the first time that a neural network is used for commercial endeavor. And it's called the MNIST. It was Jan LeCun, and it was the post office, and actually NCR was involved in this too, local company. But the post office wanted to be able to recognize through a neural network handwritten numbers. So it's like sort of the one-on-one. If you ever heard the MNIST AI, if you're learning neural networks, the first sort of lesson or lab you do is the MNIST database. But at the same time, a woman named Janet Baker starts the stake in the ground for Siri. So I have a really cool chapter about Siri and all the craziness that goes on. But Janet Baker creates Dragon Systems. But, and I won't go through all the timeline, I do in the book, but you have really interesting points in time. But the point of the thing is the benchmark. Notice like where everything's going. It's sort of slow growth in most things. But you get to about 2016, and reading comprehension just goes straight up, right? And then you get to 2018. Well, 2017 is the famous attention is all you need paper. And so if you know what the T is in GPT, it's called transformer. And a lot of people say that changed everything. I don't really think it did, and I'll explain why. But that's a really important. And then if you've heard about AlphaGo, like the first sort of computer program by the DeepMind, ultimately Google, that beat the greatest, at the time, the greatest Go player. And then you got ChatGPT. But notice here, like in 22, it just goes straight up, right? Right. So like it's kind of an interesting like compression of time, or sort of a Cambrian explosion here, starting around 2016, 17. But it gets crazier. So these are two benchmarks I like to follow. There's a lot of benchmarks. One's the sort of graduate level Google proof. This is like how well a human or an AI would do on a graduate level subject, right? And so if you go back a little less than a year ago, the state of the art on that benchmark was 60%. In less than a year, it's gone up to 84%. Right? Like these are like, if I've got a master's degree in chemistry, how well would I answer questions in biology? That's basically sort of you're at that level, but you're not a subject matter expert, but you are at that level, an engineer trained. And in the coding as well. Like at that time, human eval, which is basically a basic benchmark for coding, was what, 70%? Look where it is now, 99%, right across the board. 03, 04 Mini, Gemini 2.5, and Claude 3.7 is all within sort of 99% range. Like that's, I mean, you go back again a year ago, it was 70%. I mean, that's just insane, right? And then look what happened this year. You had the DeepSeek come out. You had, even as far as February, the reasoning was 77 and 90, and the coding was 99%. And here's for the DevOps folks. There's something called SWE-bench, Software Engineering Bench. Right? This is a benchmark of if you take an issue on GitHub, how well can it answer and fix that problem? Right? So a year ago, it was 2%. Right? 2%. Okay? There was a product called Devon that was announced about a year ago. It went up to 9%. Oh my God, 9% that it can fix things. I mean, look where the benchmark is now with Augment Agent. It's 61, 62%. It's less than a year. Anyway, so it's kind of crazy. The one other thing I like to think about is Jamie Dimon, the CEO of JP Morgan Chase, over the years, if you want to track some of his most interesting shareholder letters, he creates these shareholder, and every once in a while they're landmark. Back when the internet first started attacking banking, he wrote Silicon Valley's Coming, and they just dropped about a week ago, 2 weeks ago, the recent, and he talks heavily about so if you want the pulse of a technology from one, I think, the most interesting technology CEOs, and what he thinks. Now, you don't have to agree with him, but this is what the mind share at JP Morgan Chase is about right now about AI. It's incredibly interesting. And so I talked about the history, and then this is a really quick view. The book covers a lot of the history, and at the end I'll show you some of the names that are covered. But one of the things I was challenged while I was writing the book by a couple of good friends is that this idea of the philosophy or an epistemological approach to are you just going to talk about how AI is going to take over the world? And absolutely not. I just wanted to tell a story. In fact, when I write my books, I try to model them after Michael Lewis, right? I like to sort of take a Moneyball story or take a deep technology and then go ahead and try to explain it to two people, a subject matter expert and my mother-in-law, right? And I did that in my Deming book. I mean, the sort of my crowning achievement was my mother-in-law understood Schrodinger's cat, right? That was a win, right? So that's what I'm trying to do. And I really sped out, in those 23 books, they all had an opinion about artificial general intelligence or ASI, AGI. And that's nonsense to me. And I'll get to it in a little bit. Because I was challenged by a few people that thought I was going to go the route of talking about how AI is going to take over the world and how glorious. And by the way, I'm a big fan of AI. I'm also a realist, right? And so I got challenged to write this epilogue. And through a lot of advice, and it's again, the book's going to be frozen in a week from now. I'll probably still write this 3 more times before I get there. But I thought about the philosophy of AI, and a couple of things. This friend of mine, challenged me first with this idea that to study science, you have to understand the philosophy of science, right? I don't think anybody would disagree with that. So his argument is to study AI, you have to understand the philosophy of AI. And then the question is, what is the philosophy of AI? Is there a philosophy of AI? Are we even having a conversation about what it could or isn't? And so one of the things that when I was writing the book in the epilogue, and I'll tell you I created a nice sort of cultural funny story around this, is that when we started the book, I started this idea of humankind's quest to create a thinking machine. Right? And so that's really going back to 1943 when two guys tried to sort of use calculus and Boolean logic to figure out how the brain works. Right? And this sort of nails it. We wanted to build a machine that can think, and we did. By the way, my postulate is that we have created an alien cognition machine. But here's the thing. Yet all the time we were oblivious to the implied assumption statement. We have been on a quest to build a machine that thinks like humans. It never occurred to us that we might build a machine that thinks differently. And I think therein lies the discussion about the philosophy of AI, right? We have to sort of think about, okay, let's start arguing that it is or isn't a thinking machine. It is a thinking machine. But our sort of argument today is, can it ride a bicycle? Nah. It doesn't do math as good as us. Well, I mean, our math is like a very tight symbolic structure of all reasoning. So it actually does math better than us if we move those constraints. So what I did is, anybody remember the movie Arrival? Yeah, it's a cool movie. And so when I would argue with people who were doing this AGI stuff, I'm like, why are you comparing it to why are you asking questions? Can I ride a bicycle? Will it ever wash dishes? Does it do math this way? Oh, and it hallucinates. Oh my God. Well, by the way, humans hallucinate too. And then I was thinking about this movie, and the doctor in here is a linguistic, right? When they ask her to go ahead, Dr. Banks is the character, and they ask by Amy Adams, right? And they ask her, she said they want her to communicate with these alien people who we can't understand what it is. And my first thought was, she didn't go to them and say, can you ride a bicycle? You know, like she didn't ask the kind of questions we're asking with all these benchmarks. What she did is try to figure out how to communicate with him and what was the sort of scientific method of understanding that communication. In fact, one of the most interesting parts, if you watch the movie, I had to rewind it like 4 times, and there's no rewind, but like I had to keep playing it back. In the beginning, the Army colonel comes to her and says, I would like you to sort of figure out how to communicate with these aliens. Like 17 or 18 ships show up all around the Earth, right? We don't know why they're here. We can't talk to them. We don't know what. And she says, well, I have to meet him. And he says, absolutely not. And so then he goes, well, I'm leaving. And she names, so you're going to see this person next, probably the second best linguistics, right? And she says, well, before you talk to him, ask him what the translation of war in Sanskrit is. And you can't even hardly hear it. And then the general comes back the next day with a helicopter to pick her up, and she's like, kind of, what did he say? And he said, argument. And so there was nothing in the movie about this. So the geek I am, I went out and found some threads of all these linguists who explain everything about that dialogue. Turns out the translation of war, or one of the translations of war in Sanskrit, is more cows. So here's the point. If she was focused on the way the human bias was of communicating with those things, it would have probably been focused on war and threat and all these ideas. And that's why it was so critical for her to make that statement of ask him this, because we might go down the communication. Anyway, what I'm trying to say is that's a meta for, I think, how we're sort of communicating with AI right now. And so going back to the epistemology, right, I think you can reasonably say that if we map reasoning to AI, we could say that deductive reasoning is basically expert systems. I know, like I've gotten, kind of almost punched in the face for saying this, but I think it's a good structure for thinking about. Your expert systems are rule-based, right? Some people call that symbolic AI. And then your sort of neural networks are your inductive reasoning. Right? And so the missing piece right now that I think we have to sort of debate or understand is what's called abductive reasoning. And abductive reasoning is like if you're old enough to remember the Columbo show, right? He shows up for a murder mystery, he looks around, and part of his instinct, part of like the way somebody's dressed, all those things sort of hit. And it's sort of that human aspect that the models can't, the models only know what the models know. Now, that it can do brilliant correlations to get to what appears to be emergent behavior. But if you know the AlphaGo story, Move 78, if you don't look it up, and it's in my book, or you read my book, is that is an abductive. There was no model for the move that he made that beat AlphaGo. And then, so of course, I struggled so hard in my book to figure out how to get Deming in it. And it was down to the wire where, like, you know what? I'm sorry, this ain't going to happen. There's no Deming in this book, in this history of AI. I mean, I even, did research on was there any sort of dialogue between, if you know, Herbert Simon was a big influencer of Dr. Deming or cross-influencer. And Herbert Simon is a critical piece to the history of AI, right? There was no, surely there was a letter somewhere between Deming. Deming wrote letters to everybody, and I couldn't find any. Until I got to the end, and I started thinking about, how do I describe this philosophy of AI? And one of Deming's, that book, the whole book is about his journey to come up with something called system profound knowledge, which is a profound way, a profound model for a framework of how to deal with complexity or organizations. And it is quite frankly, it's 4 pieces, or it's 4 elements of a lens to understand complexity. And if I apply it to the philosophy of AI, abductive reasoning, theory of knowledge, scientific method. It was what Dr. Banks did in Arrival, right? She went in there with a scientific, abductive reasoning mindset to communicate with the aliens. She didn't come in with this sort of, well, if you say this, then you're probably here to destroy humankind. If you say this, right? She went in with a sort of open mind of how to deal with it. Variation is a big part of the Deming philosophy. In there, it's understanding signal and noise. Here again, with AI, I think we need to, I think noise is an AGI argument. Noise is every time a new model comes out, Ethan Mollick, bless his soul, wrote a great book, tries to prove whether it can do math or not. I mean, that's just wasted brain power. All these comparisons that everybody does every time a new model comes out, I think we're just wasting your time. And then people say that the attention is all you need. The Transformer paper by Google it changed everything. And it changed everything to a small group of geeks, honestly. Because GPT-3.5, there was still a very small community of people that were using GPT-3.5. It wasn't until they put a UX, a simple chat UX, on all that 80, 90, you could say 200 years worth of technology, that everything changed. So it was ChatGPT. The point of my book is ChatGPT didn't have it in March 2022. It started basically 1943, and even before that, of a real beautiful journey of all these rebels. And then appreciation of the system is, I think this is the other thing we have to deal with, is AI has been built by humans, because what do we know? We know it's sort of grokked everything that humans have talked about on the internet. And so it has all our biases and all our flaws. But when people say, stop, I can't use AI because it hallucinates, well, guess what? We all have those same biases, and it is just an extension of something we've created, a Frankenstein of ourselves. So stop talking about AGI. It doesn't matter. It's an alien cognition, but it's different from us, so comparing to us is a waste of time. And I think it takes away the oxygen from having more meaningful conversations, what I call the philosophy of AI, which I haven't even begun to have a deep understanding of. But I think our industry is not having that either. And like the philosophy of science, we need to basically adopt this. Anyway, here's sort of a list of the different characters. And this is just a short list. I will warn you, there's a lot of characters in this book, but there's no way around that. But, Ada Lovelace, brilliant, unbelievable. And what I love to do is tell, human stories. So tell you, how brilliant she was and what she did and how she translated the Babbage analytical engine. But she's also, a massive gambler in horse betting race, and lost a ton of money. Alan Turing, of course. I'll save Walter Pitts for a minute. Claude Shannon used to ride around IBM building or Bell Labs buildings in a tricycle. Right, John McCarthy, Minsky, Grace Hopper. I didn't realize this until late in the story, how instrumental Grace Hopper is to the history of AI. Because she's the first one that takes a natural language approach to bits and bytes. A compiler basically is the first NLP, if you think about it, right? Jan LeCun, of course. Janet Baker, I talked about. She's, basically starts the whole voice recognition. Jeffrey Hinton, Dennis Hatzabach, that's a book by itself. He's at, when he's 4, he beats his dad in chess. At 11, he's a chess master. At 13, he wants to basically cure cancer. And then last year, he won the Nobel Prize for protein folding. Oop, sorry, no calls right now. Just a fascinating human, right? And that's the beauty of all these people. They're just fascinating. Fei-Fei Li, if Fei-Fei Li doesn't do what she does, we don't have ChatGPT in 2022. And nobody talks about her. They talk about the Godfather, LeCun, and Hinton. You very rarely hear what Fei-Fei Li. And Fei-Fei Li, just the short version is she took a ton of images, a ton of NLP words, used Mechanical Turk, slammed them together, and got us to the place where, most of the pictures we build today on Sora or any of the tools, right, that exists, right? And Joyce Bolimi, she's got a great book. Actually, Joyce Bolimi was a student at Georgia Tech, and she basically had an AI project where the AI project couldn't recognize her because of the color of her skin. And she started a whole thing about AI ethics and the bias in AI, and it's a brilliant, brilliant book. I cover a chapter about her, but I would definitely recommend buying her book. All right, so we got about 6 minutes, and I'm going to tell you my favorite story in my book. So there's this guy, Walter Pitts, and we'll come back to it. This guy should be the movie. He's one of the guys who wrote that paper in 43 basically the first neural network paper. But he winds up getting involved with 3 other people. This McCullough, if you've heard of Norbert Wiener, and a guy you probably heard of is Letvin, Jerry Letvin. So these guys are, I call them the Beatles of epistemology, right? And so they literally are together, and they have an office at MIT, and they put a sign under it. I could never find the real sign, but it was like a paper sign, and the sign of the office said, experimental epistemology. And by the way, AI is called AI because John McCarthy was lazy and picked a terrible name. It should have been called cybernetics, right? And there was some jealousy and all that, right? So Norbert Wiener and his gang are solving things in the 50s that literally would change the world. And here's where it gets the interesting human story. So Norbert Wiener is basically a failure. We hear him today if people study cybernetics and how important it is, but he was this prodigy, the youngest person to get into Harvard. He basically, but he was a failure. He kept like losing jobs. And his wife was an heir to, she was like very frustrated that her husband that she married didn't become the man. And somehow it turns out she accused this guy, Walter Pitts, I know I'm bouncing around, but I'm going to cover Walter Pitts in a minute, of having an affair with their daughter. Now, their daughter was 18 or 7, like old enough, but it was false. So it broke up the Beatles. So she was the Yoko Lennon. All right, so if these 4 would have stayed together, it's unimaginable what like AI would have looked like and the stuff we're doing. But what's more fascinating is this Walter Pitts guy. So Walter Pitts is a real-life Goodwill Hunting character. He basically, at about 12, is homeless, speaks 3 languages, gets chased by a gang in Detroit, hides out in Detroit Public Library, reads, picks up, just because he has nothing else to do, Bertrand Russell's Principia Mathematica, 10-volume, sends a letter to Bertrand Russell telling him that he's made a mistake. Bertrand Russell thinks he's talking to a PhD student, invites this 13-year-old to come to Cambridge, which is not going to happen. A couple of years later, they sort of meet up at University of Chicago. They realize how brilliant this young man is. So they hook him up with basically this team, right? This McCullough, Letvin, and so they all hang out together. And they're like, if you remember the On the Road Jack Kerouac characters, like apparently they're doing drugs at night, they're having bonfires, and they're talking about like really deep subjects, right? And then the 3 of them go to work the next day. So McCullough is a professor teaching psychology. Letvin is a professor teaching biology. And Pitts, they get him a job as a janitor at the university so he can hang around with them. So he's a real-life janitor. And here's the sort of crushing story, right? So like he's a janitor, like the Matt Damon character in Good Will Hunting. Anyway, he starts working heavily with Norbert Wiener. Norbert Wiener is his advisor. He actually works on his dissertation for a PhD, this Pitts guy. And it's brilliant, right? And turns out, because of the accusation, Norbert Wiener is not allowed to hang out with him anymore. He is so distraught, becomes alcoholic. He burns his dissertation. Harvard literally tries to pull it out of the ashes because they know how important it is. And here's the killer. I did some research. The name of the paper is called Probabilistic Three-Dimensional Neural Networks. And here's why this is so interesting. This is 1960. We don't get multi-layer networks till the 1980s. What you call a deep neural network. Hinton creates those in 1980. This guy was literally already describing in 1960 a paper that was to describe what happened in the 80s with the first sort of like deep neural networks. And it was destroyed. He destroyed it. The world never got to see it. I know that's very geeky, but like if you understand what a multi-layer network was versus the original single layer, it makes all the difference. And he literally apparently was going to describe what Hinton considered the godfather. So nobody knows. How many people heard of Walter Pitts? Right? Nobody. Most people who at least been around AI know Geoffrey Hinton. Right, and nobody's heard of Pitts. Pitts might have actually created the first deep neural network in 1960 in his paper. Anyway, I do, I'll talk about this tomorrow. I love writing books, and so I've been working on a tool that helps people write books, and it's kind of fun. I'll do open space tomorrow about a model that sort of learns and helps you. Most people tell me they hate writing books, but I love them. Anyway, that's me. Thank you so much, and try not to be, for the rest of the speakers, not too mean. My wife's here, so hey. All right, thank you all.